Good evening. This is Kiana, and today we are going to be talking about an article that was published in the New York Times. Now, this article has to deal with the psychiatric system in the United States of America and some of the corruption that is actually taking place. There was a video that I published roughly, I think, about 2 weeks ago about a four-top singer. His name was Alexander Morris, who was held against his will in a psychiatric hospital in the United States. So I will actually link that video possibly in the description or include it at the end of this video. So we are going to be speaking about that, and we're going to be kind of pulling from some of the highlights from that article and have a discussion on it. So let's do that now. And before we actually get into that article, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It's at Real Kiana Canada, at Real Kiana Canada. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Kiana_Canada, Kiana_Canada. I'm also available on Facebook, which is linked to this account. And you can, again, don't forget to subscribe. So let's go ahead and get into the article. So this article is talking about a psychiatric facility named Acadia. And so what this facility did was it lured patients into its facilities and held them against their will, even when detaining them was not medically necessary. So there were a few accounts that kind of describe from patients who actually describe their experiences within this institution. And so one woman who works at a children's hospital was held for 7 days after she showed up at Acadia facility in Indiana looking for therapy. And after police officers raided an Acadia hospital in Georgia, 16 patients told investigators that they had been kept with no excuses or valid reason. So this was according to police reports. Now, one woman in Michigan said that in an interview that she had lost her job while detained. So Acadia is a company that has facilities all over the country in the United States. And a man who was held in a Utah facility said that he had been, or rather, he had become afraid to seek help since he was held at Acadia for a week in 2021. And so a dozen of patients were interviewed who said that they had been held against their will and now they described that they had seen patients, including children, being assaulted and neglected in these facilities. And when we're moving forward, I want you to keep in mind that Acadia actually held all of these patients under laws meant for people who pose imminent threat to themselves or others. Howsoever, these patients did not pose an imminent threat to themselves or others. They were actually perfectly healthy, sane individuals. And again, reports have indicated that none of these patients that were held had met that legal standard, that they posed an imminent risk or danger to others. And so you can see how corrupt this system is and how how it makes victims powerless, right? And so let's say, for instance, you go into a facility for a checkup and you just want to have a conversation. Maybe you're feeling down. And then next thing you know, you are being asked for your keys or being asked for your belongings in a similar vein, such as Alexander Morris. They're taking these items away from you. You're being detained in a facility against your will. You're being held there against your will for several days on end. And you can't be released because in order for you to be released from this hospital, you have to have a doctor's approval. And it's the doctors that are keeping you in this facility. So you can see for these patients at Acadia, they have really experienced a very frightening situation, which was a violation, in my opinion, of their civil rights. And so, why are they detaining people against their wills? Well, here you go. Acadia, which charges $2,000 a day for some patient, and at times deploys an array of strategies to persuade insurers to cover longer stays. So you see, Acadia is charging a lot of money, $2,000 a day for a person. That's a lot of money. And then they are having conversations with the insurer. So they're persuading these insurers to keep patients longer than they need to be kept. Sometimes healthy persons that really don't need to be in this particular situation. And so evidence shows that Acadia has actually exaggerated patient symptoms and conditions, and it has tweaked medical dosages. So, can you believe that? It's tweaking medication dosages, and then what they're doing this to claim that the patient needs to stay longer than is medically necessary. And so I want you to think about this. It has also been argued that patients are not well enough to leave because they did not finish a meal. So think about it. You have someone who doesn't belong in there anyway. And sometimes, when you are stressed out, or are frustrated, or you can't understand a situation quite clearly, and or you just lost your appetite because things are on your mind. I think we all can agree that at one point at a time or another, that we just didn't feel like eating. We just lost our appetite, and we just felt like, okay, well, I'm just not going to eat today, or I'm not as hungry as I maybe as I should be, or I just don't feel like eating. Maybe I ate enough at lunchtime, not and I'm still hungry at dinner. Well, in this particular situation, what the hospital is doing is that if you don't finish your meal, then they are tacking more time onto your stay. And so you can see how this is a very corrupt situation that's happening in the United States of America. And although the reports are stating that federal investigators have looked into this situation and found that the hospital was in the wrong, what about circumstances where this is just I'll say this is just the tip of the iceberg. What about those hospitals where that have not been investigated, where the victims have not been able to speak out? And what about those victims who haven't been given a platform? This is happening every single day in the United States. Americans are being persecuted and robbed of their financial situation by state officials, and it's quite alarming. And so the New York Times, what it did was it identified 8 instances of Acadia's holding people who had voluntarily checked themselves in, but then changed their minds. So we understand that if you voluntarily check yourself into an institution, and you're not a threat to yourself or others, so you're not an imminent risk to yourself or others, or maybe you just voluntarily checked yourself in because you have a headache, or maybe because you feel sad, but you're not having any ideations. Well, you are supposed to be able to leave at your own volition. They're not supposed to hold you against your will. But in this particular situation, at this within this particular institution, they're saying no. That if you check yourself in, that you're going to stay until they say that you can leave. And so Again, Acadia, what it does is it goes to great lengths to convince, according to the New York Times, ensures that the patient should stay to stay as long as possible. And this is really often around 5 days, sometimes it's more. And to do that, Acadia needs to show that the patients are unsuitable and unstable and require ongoing intensive care. And there has been, in this reporting, they were told to use words like combative. They were told to use words like these buzzwords such as, aggressive and combative. And when these buzzwords are used, that this is an indication to, I guess, the practitioners that the patient should stay longer than the patient would wish. But, and they also were instructed not to use words such as, don't use words such as calm or the patient is compliant. Don't use any of these words. Use aggressive words so that this patient can stay longer than they are asking to be that they're asking to remain in this facility. And so, as you can see, this is a very serious situation. And I'm trying to see if there's anything else in this article that I should be. Yeah, so this is a very serious situation, and it's quite alarming that this is happening. And it brings to my mind that the United States really does need to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This convention also covers medical condition. It actually protects people who are in psychological situations. And I'm going to be reading. I've been reading this book, which I found to be like quite intriguing and interesting. And you can see, like, I've placed like a lot of notes here because there's been like a lot of different places that have a very useful information in it. But this book is called International Human Rights and Mental Disability Law, and it's When the Silenced Are Heard. And this book is by Michael L. Perland, and this is very an informative read. It talks about the UN Convention on Human Rights. It talks about where people are placed in psychiatric institutions to silence dissent, so issues of transnational repression. And there are a lot of instances in this book where it points out how the United States, and not only the United States, but other countries as well, are holding perfectly sane individuals in psychiatric holding facilities and trying to, I guess, induce a psychosis in them to undermine their testimony as an epistemic subject. It also talks about how the United States and other countries as well are using the psychiatry system for political reasons and for political purposes. And there's just something I really found interesting in this book that I want to read. And it has to also do with the article, the New York Times publication, and also the situation with Alexander Morris. But here we go. So, psychiatric incarceration of mentally healthy people is uniformly understood to be a particularly pernicious form of repression because it uses the powerful modalities of medicine as tools of punishment and compounds a deep affront to human rights with deception and fraud. And so doctors who allow themselves to be used in this way, certainly as collaborators, but even as victims of intimidation, of course, by the state, betray the trust of society and breach their most basic ethical obligations as professionals. And so you can kind of see, like, sometimes what is happening is that in certain situations, and doctors are even being coerced into keeping patients in facilities at the request of governmental officials. And of course, this breaches the trust of society, because what it does is that it makes patients, and not only patients, but society, fear practitioners, to fear psychological and psychiatric treatment. And it's quite alarming. It really is. Let's see, was there anything else? Okay, there's another section that I want to read, and this is talking about like how there was an experience in a similar situation, and it said, at the bottom, the human rights problem raised by the prosecutions is the criminalization of dissent. Now, we know in this particular situation with the New York Times article and in Alexander Morris's case, there wasn't any political dissent. But in a lot of cases, there are political dissent. There are people that are speaking out, and they're being placed in these institutions, and they're being fed medications against their will, right? And so repression and dissent is problematic whether the dissenter is sent to jail or sent to a psychiatric hospital. However, it would be a mistake to regard the hospitalization of dissidents as only a derivative problem. To hospitalize a dissenter who is not mentally ill on grounds of I lost my place, combines repression with moral fraud and magnifies the violation of human rights. It demeans the dissenter's dignity, devalue his or her message, and establishes the legal authority for an indeterminate period of what can only be called psychiatric punishment. And so, in this particular situation, I think that we could all agree that when you are being held in a facility, when you haven't committed a crime, when you are perfectly sane and you're being held in an institution of this degree, that can be considered a form of punishment. And it's a form of punishment in a number of ways. One, it's a form of punishment because your freedom of movement is restricted and you're being detained against your will. So there are a few rights that are being violated here. So there is the seizure violation because things are being taken away from you. There is the search violation because oftentimes in this situation, you're being searched against your will. There is, of course, that violation where you are being unlawfully detained, wrongfully detained. And then there is the violation where there is an affront to a person's dignity, right? And there is this aspect of this person trying to get out of that situation, but being held against their will. So, what it does, in my personal opinion, is that it undermines the testimony of this epistemic subject, right? This person who, and I talk about this a lot in my videos, a person who is able to know, a person who is able to reason, a person who is able to understand events properly. But of course, in this particular situation, what is often happening is that the government and sometimes, well, these institutions, but oftentimes the government is misusing their power and placing perfectly sane Americans in these institutions who really don't have a psychiatric condition, who are not an imminent threat to themselves or others, who maybe just went to a doctor for a minor issue and was detained because these institutions need to make money. And on the more insidious side, sometimes the government is calling on these institutions to detain certain Americans for political reasons, which is, of course, against international human rights law. So, as you can see, this was a very intriguing article. I would recommend that you read it. It's called How a Leading Chain of Psychiatric Hospitals Trap Patients. It is very informative. And I would also recommend that you check out this book. It's called International Human Rights and Mental Disability Law. If you are a law student, or if you're just interested in the law, you're interested in human rights, this would be a very interesting read to look into. There is a lot of good information in this book. And again, this book often, it really delves deeply into the UN Convention. And so, of course, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I think the more that these stories surface, the more it is a call on the United States really to ratify this convention and to protect the vulnerable Americans. I am very concerned that the United States is one, when you look at all the democracies, the United States is like one of the only democracies that has not ratified the UN conventions. And it raises a question as to why. Like, why is this not happening? And how is it, are we being tricked in some way? Is a question, is a good question to raise, right? Because we're being told that the United States is the land of the free, the country which is the blueprint for other countries to follow. And yet the United States has not ratified some of the most important conventions that protects human rights, that is, it's not a party to the International Criminal Court. So it raises the question as to whether the United States should be in this leading position or whether somebody else should be at the helm. So I'm Kiana Canada. This is the conclusion of this video. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and look forward to talking to you next time. Bye-bye.